I am going to ask Tim to start recording now. All right. Welcome everyone to the Association for Collaborative Leadership Virtual Professional Development Committee's edition, September 2018 edition of our webinar series. Today we are talking about consortium leadership from the search firm's perspective. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our colleagues and panelists here, Jeff Kessner, who is a managing associate at Isaacson Miller, and Jim Sirianni, who's a partner at Storbeck Pimentel. And both have been involved in consortium searches, but also, of course, your more traditional higher ed searches, and have a real perspective to share on what's different about our environment, the organizations that we work for, and a lot about what's going to be the same. So we will start with some introductory remarks from Jeff and Jim, and then I'll ask a question or two, but I'll encourage the attendees here to share their questions, and as Jim and Jeff are talking, and I'll be calling on you throughout this program. So without further ado, I'd love to get started. Let's hear from Jeff first. Jeff, will you tell us, about your general observations and recommendations about these sorts of searches for consortium heads, consortium leadership? What's interesting about them, and maybe what's surprised or challenged you about them?
Sure thing, and good afternoon, or I guess good morning to some of you, good afternoon to others, and really a privilege to be here today. I have three immediate thoughts that come to mind. The first is that each consortium really has different goals, different structure, and what that means is that they're looking for different experiences and different qualities in their leaders. Well, it's true that different campuses, universities are different. I think there's significantly more variation between consortia than you find between different types of campuses. Secondly, so many stakeholders are involved here, and this is a challenge for the search itself, and I think ultimately for the person that is selected from a governance perspective, right? A president of a college or university is ultimately reporting to a board of trustees, and while that's true here too, oftentimes those board members are coming from different institutions advocating for different things, and in some ways advocating for their different respective institutions. And the third thing I'd bring up is that I think it's especially important to know when to lead, when to influence, and when to follow as a leader of a consortium. Again, I think this is true in a lot of different leadership roles, but in my experience, it's especially true in these types of positions where the head of a consortium is working with so many different stakeholders, and sort of direct lines of authority always aren't as clear as they may be in other positions. And so sort of keeping those three different sort of leadership qualities in mind, I think, is helpful.
Thanks, Jeff. Jim, you have some, not just some comments and observations, but perhaps some advice for those who might be considering consortium leadership roles themselves?
Yes, and I agree with all of Jeff's observations. I think they're right on the money. Couldn't agree more, and I think as time passes, we're seeing a heightening of each of those observations or phenomena, if you will. So to share some introductory remarks, I thought I might offer, as you commented, some specific advice or reminders for folks who are considering the pursuit of leadership positions within consortia. Some may sound obvious, but I'm going to put them forward anyway because they are really incredibly important. The first is to keep in one's mind the importance of being an advocate and a really effective advocate. As one would go through a search process for these kinds of roles, there is perhaps nothing as important. And there are many responsibilities, of course, that leaders of consortia have. Many different, or the array of activities really can be astonishing. That being said, I would argue that there is no responsibility as important as being an effective advocate for the consortia. So thinking about how to prepare for that, getting to know, becoming familiar with the criticisms or critiques. So not simply finding comfort or being comfortable in familiar or friendly confines, but to really understand the arguments of your fiercest critics and being able to untangle those, and through both empirical evidence and storytelling, being able to be an effective advocate before you're in the role, feeling it inside, being able to articulate it as clearly and compellingly as one can imagine. That's a first of three observations. Second is around, and this is the one I alluded to as being perhaps obvious, but it's worth stating again, it's doing one's homework, doing the research to be prepared to be able to have a more than surface level conversation with committees during the interview process, during the search process. The more homework you've done, the better you understand the current situation and future needs of consortia and associations, the better you're going to be able to really engage in dialogue that's both interesting and meaningful for committees as they have big decisions to make. And last of my three initial comments is around partnerships. Of course, in their origin, consortia are partnerships in one sense. Beyond the borders of the confederation of organizations that comprise a consortia, thinking about partnerships outside and with other, whether it be with other consortia, with government, with industry and so forth, that has never been more important across the searches I've worked on with these kinds of organizations. And to understand that and then think creatively and think really in a forward-looking way about how partnerships can be a bridge to a brighter future for consortia and their constituent members.
Thanks, Jim. So I've got, thanks for those introductory remarks and this good broad sense of your perspective on things. But I'd like to get a little more specific now. Get into a little bit about your process and how your process as a search firms are to sort of help the those who are looking for the leader get to know them, really understand who they are, what their values are, and where they see the organizations going. Right. So when your search firm, and I'll start with you, Jim, this time. So when you went around to the campuses or to the board, what questions did you ask them? How did you discover what was required of this consortial or this particular consortium's leadership? How did you unearth that?
Sure. So there are a couple of key questions. Of course, they're posed differently to different audiences within a consortial membership, but at the end of the day, there are a couple that stand out. The first is to ask members of the community what their points of pride are. And sometimes that looks like asking them, well, why might someone who's already enjoying satisfying work at an institution or other organization, why might they take interest in it? Hearing what folks share about their greatest pride or points of pride really can tell you an awful lot about where the organization is, the cultural mores of an organization or consortia. The second, and maybe the key question, is asking them to articulate what they see as the key opportunities and challenges for their next leader. In some ways, two sides of the same coin, but really getting a thorough understanding and really probing on what those challenges are, what those opportunities for the future are. And the last question, getting an understanding around the qualities or attributes, kind of the style, if you will, of the organization, what the next leader needs to be able to hit the ground running, doing, and have the skills and experience, or even in their constitution, what would work well for the consortium, given their goals for the future.
Jeff, anything to add or elaborate on from your point of view, your experience?
Well, and I would agree with everything that Jim said. We often go in and ask similar questions. One additional question that we often pose to individuals that we're meeting with is we ask them to pause their imagination and allow us to imagine that we're 5 years in the future. I'm back there on their campus and I'm talking to them, or in their office, and I ask how things are going with their new hire, and they say it's been amazing, it's been fantastic, and I respond and I say, great, how do you know that? So what are the tangible things that have changed? What has not changed? And that's a good thing, because it's something that's part of the culture that you don't want to be different moving forward. And that helps to sort of help us as search consultants understand what some of the goals are for the consortium and or for the individual campuses, and how they hope to interact with the consortia in the future.
And Jeff, I mean, and I'll ask you this as well, Jim, who are the stakeholders that you're talking to? Is it just the board, or are there others involved too? Those of us who lead consortia sometimes feel like we have, we're pulled in many different directions. So how much of a sense of that do you get? Who are you talking to identify what that 5-year vision is supposed to be?
So I always try to speak with as many different constituencies as possible. So that includes certainly staff at the consortia. It includes people on the individual campuses that have meaningful interactions with the consortia, and perhaps other folks on the campuses who aren't currently having meaningful interaction with people at the consortia, but would like to in the future. So that can be chief functional officers, that can be, if it's an academic alliance, it can be folks on the faculty, faculty leaders. It really does depend on the individual consortium and sort of how it's structured.
And Jim?
Yeah, I'd echo Jeff's comments, and particularly where a consortia is academic in its focus, whether it's faculty engagement, student sharing with student programs, and so forth. Being able to bring together chief academic officers, I find that to be a really robust opportunity to hear, oftentimes very, very complementary in similar ways to their presidents and chancellors. But there is a different way of speaking about and thinking about consortia that the chief academic officers have. And that often, at the end of the day, is really quite useful when it comes time to talk with prospects and candidates about what's exciting in that opportunity, as well as what's vexing. What are the fundamental tensions or frictions that consortia has faced in recent years? And not always, but there were times when I actually reach out to recent funders, or if there were significant funders, and just wanting to get their perspective. Not that it's dispositive in any sense, but really want to paint, just like Jeff was saying, paint a broad picture, get a really thorough understanding about how different folks are seeing that old metaphor about the elephant, how folks, depending on their vantage point, they'll have a different perception. Being able to bring that all together is going to be important.
So that seems to present a challenge for writing that job description. So if you're talking to all these different people and perhaps they have different ideas of what the consortium should be doing, and as Jeff said, you're talking to people who maybe, aren't working with the consortium but feel like they should be. How is that? Tell me, first of all, I'd like to hear a little bit about that challenge if you can share with anything candidly. But I'm also interested, more to the point of, how is that any different than writing the description of another association president or of a campus-based position, or in what ways is it truly different? Jeff?
So I think there are a number of important parallels to make to sort of the head of an association. And my personal experience doing search associations are largely on academic scholarly associations, not on functional area associations. And I think there's often a conversation there that I think there are important parallels for a consortium. Sort of what is the proper role of the organization? How broad is its reach? What should it be doing? What should it not be doing? I think that, there's no easy answer to that, right? I mean, those are difficult conversations, and that means writing the position profile is often a challenge. I think ultimately this is a board decision, right? It's a strategic decision that the organization needs to make, whether it's an association or a consortium. And I think part of our role as search consultants, and Jim, I trust you would probably agree with this, that part of our role is to help them figure that out. And we're not just going and helping them to find candidates, but help them figure out what they're looking for, and then how can we help find the right candidates to align.
Jim, anything to add?
Yeah, no, and so to piggyback off of Jeff's comment, there are a set of, I don't want to say tricks, but heuristics and tools and exercises that we all, I know Jeff's firm as well, that we bring into the conversation with the board to promote a kind of dialogue that will be productive, right? There's a difference between productive conflict and conversation and sort of bickering, if you will, and being able to identify sooner rather than later where those core elements of commonality, where that common ground is. And then from that, being able to spin off and test the waters on a number of other features that are in play. It's important to do. It's important to do early and to pressure test along the way. And I think later in our conversation today, we'll talk about how we think about candidates and work with candidates. Part of it, I think, is bringing together the board and pressure testing the kinds of the profiles that initially they described they were interested in, the kinds of experiences and acumen or even the interpersonal skills that they were prizing right out of the gate, that still holds true as you make your way into the search. Those are some of the techniques, but important to not be distracted by the allure of talking with candidates, but to check in with the board, check in with the search committee throughout the process.
So so our audience is going to be interested in also hearing about the similarities between the searches for themselves, for consortium heads, and searches for other organizations who are your clients, like Jeff, you mentioned certain academic associations, but also some of these kind of national administrative associations like a NACUBO or NAPE or something like that. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on how somebody in this position who might be already running a consortium or thinking about it might think even more expansively about roles that require similar skills or that are similar to other searches that you've done?
Absolutely. I think, I said before, I think there's a lot of parallels between associations and consortiums and the type of leadership that both types of organizations are looking for. I think in both cases, you're dealing with, at the head of the organization, board members that are representing different institutions, different priorities, and often a staff that's working sort of apart from sort of member institutions or organizations, right? I think one key difference that you'll find in association searches is that you're, leading a group of individuals that are focused on one particular area. If it's an academic area, it's their area of scholarship, right? So Modern Language Association or American Sociological Association. If it's a functional area, it's chief student affairs officers or whatever it may be. And so in some ways you get groups with deeper expertise in a particular area, and obviously you have to have often you need to have that share that area of expertise. Although increasingly, I think you're seeing some associations bring in leaders that just have more leadership experience, but don't necessarily come from that particular academic discipline or functional area. But again, I think if you can find that match, I think that the actual skills are quite transferable. In both cases, you're leading broad organizations of often disparate staff or just disparate members, and the work itself is quite similar.
Jim?
The topic of leading through influence ends up being remarkably similar across these campus-based roles, other associations, and consortia as well. It's not the command and control style that you might find in some other positions, particularly those sort of earlier career managerial activities, but genuine leadership and leadership through compelling storytelling, through influence, through being able to find sort of a gestalt, if you will, and run with it. And that's a common thread. And we've been fortunate in our country to be able to find a real robust group of individuals who have thrived in those early career, more managerial types of activities, and then make that pivot or take that step up to genuine leadership and lead institutions, lead consortia, other organizations committed to the common good, the public good, and it's been our good fortune as a nation.
So we're starting to get some questions from our attendees here. I'm going to first turn to Jeff Oberg. I am allowing him to talk now, giving him the option of asking this question live. Jeff, I am trying to unmute you, and there you go. Why don't you go ahead?
Greetings, and thank you very much for your comments and sharing your insights. Just wondered, from your perspective, you mentioned that it seemed to be more differences amongst consortiums than there were among the universities, and just wondered if you could kind of expand on it a little bit and kind of highlight some of those differences for the benefit of those who might be interested in future leadership of consortiums.
Sure, and I think it was me who said that, so I'm happy to sort of take a stab at answering the question. And I guess to clarify what I meant is that, obviously there are many different types of institutions. Liberal arts colleges are quite different from R1 research institutions, but my point perhaps is more that I think that there are no two consortia that I've seen that really are structured quite alike. Each one's very different, and I think there are a lot more, parallels between different types of between different individual liberal arts colleges or different R1 institutions than between consortia. I think the structures, there's just much more variation between them, different goals, different governance bodies. I think it's difficult to make a generalization across consortia other than they're there to promote some sort of, we're stronger together than apart mantra, whereas I think you can make some broad statements about, say, a liberal arts college, which is that, they're small, more personalized attention than you get at a larger institution, so on and so forth. So I guess that was my point there. So, and to piggyback off what Jim said before, what that requires is that you do your due diligence as you're investigating these opportunities to really learn what makes a particular consortia tick and what makes it different from others.
Jim, what about your thoughts on how diverse consortia are? Is it, and the lessons that apply, what you learn from one? Is it the case that if you know one consortium, if you've met one consortium, you've met one consortium?
No, it's that if you've met one, you've met one. I think that's much more the case than if you've met one, you met them all. There are unique histories that, really fascinating histories that drive in a lot of ways the way in which members see one another and see the consortia, and that's important. It doesn't always tell you everything you need to know. It certainly doesn't tell you everything you need to know about consortia, but the importance of culture in getting a real thorough understanding of how the organization has worked, how the consortia, when it's hit bumps over time, what were the root causes, what were the remedies, and how have folks moved forward within the consortium, or the actual participation has changed. Do we have more members? Do we have fewer? And what does this look like? I'd laminate on top of that observation, particularly those that are led by presidents of campuses. As we've seen the length of tenure for presidents decline somewhat, there are very often consortia that each time they convene, there is someone who has less than a year under their belt. And if she or he, that next president is getting up to speed about the consortia, as others are, their colleagues are in the midst of making, 10-year, 15-year defining decisions with their engagement. It's a bit different than when you have a seasoned team all on the same page and familiar with that history. So that's something that I actually spend a good bit of time thinking about. And then, as I know we all do, Jeff's colleagues and he as well, working with those newly appointed members of the board to ensure that they're going to be able to play music well, right? Like that they will be not just in tune on the face of it, but they'll understand the positions and the histories that undergird the current state of the consortium.
So a quick follow-up question then, Jim. Board turnover, feature or bug?
Oh, it's inevitable. It's a reflection of the times we live in. There are obviously opportunities that come with the kind of board turnover, and there are challenges as well. It's at this point, this sort of many reps under my belt, it's not a cause for concern. It's just a matter of taking the time and investing the time early on to ensure that you have that engagement, and that where there are unanswered questions, you're able to provide answers early and often, and ensure that the board can work well together, and that they can focus then on the substantive matters of the day, really the highest use of their common time together. That's what fires me up in a positive way, to knowing that will be a piece of the puzzle, and moving forward, helping to position them to have the most robust, real intellectual or leadership focused debates that they can have.
And Jeff, to just add one more follow-up question to Jeff Oberg's good question, what you led a search at a consortium where there was kind of one outlier, one institution that was much larger than all the other ones. How did that, pose certain challenges, or how did that diversity within the consortium reveal itself in your work of identifying its next leader?
Well, I think there's an interesting sense of how how the different institutions view the consortium and how they sort of buy into the consortium and I don't mean monetarily necessarily, although that certainly is part of it in some cases. I think that, for instance, so it was 5 colleges, just to be clear, so folks know it was 4 large colleges and 1 large public, and there are issues around shared services where that makes sense for the smaller institutions that are geographically proximate, but maybe doesn't make as much sense for larger institutions. So what I think it means is that there has to be frank conversations at the beginning of not just of a search, but really they should be ongoing, even when a search isn't happening, around how the different institutions what makes the most sense? Where are areas where all members are participating equally? Where does it make sense for some members to participate in that part of the consortium, but maybe not all? It doesn't have to be one or the other. There are lots of different ways to slice and dice these things, and those can change over time too. They don't need to be static. And so, building off the point earlier about sort of the transition in the board, and there are a whole lot of challenges with that, I do think getting new leadership in, where people may have been at different institutions, see things done differently, have a different perspective, that can be really healthy, I think, to bring to a new institution, a new consortium, because that's how change can happen.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks, Jeff Oberg, for that question. I'm now going to invite Vicki McGillen to share her question, which is about creating that search position description. Vicki, go ahead.
Thanks, Kiernan. My question had to do with the reference to resolving the creative tensions across the board when you're developing the prospectus, and in part recognizing, is there not a danger that part of that smoothing out of the creative tensions can result in profiles that sound remarkably similar for all of the walk-on-water characteristics that you're seeking in a consortium leader. Given your particular references to the importance of doing homework, are there particular things you would direct people to look for that might help them go below just the simple prospective description of what they're looking for?
Jim,
this is Jim. I'm happy to kick us off or get us started on that. It's a great question. It's really interesting because this is a frequent dilemma or consideration that the prospective candidates are wading through. My advice is to be as candid and straightforward with the search consultants that are working with the consortia, and to say, I'm wondering, I didn't see X or Y, or I seemed a little sort of vanilla in terms of the qualities and characteristics, to ask really pretty directly, and not to be shy about emailing the consultant, say, hey, let's get on the phone and talk about this. It's an attractive opportunity in some ways, but I'd love to learn more and poke your mind about what you see. And I think that's where a position profile is a really pretty formal document and plays an important role. And you won't necessarily see, not an attempt to be tricky or sneaky, but you won't see everything that perhaps matters at the end of the day in those profiles. Just because, again, I do want to say there is clearly a good faith effort on the parts of committees to bring forward an attractive and representative profile, but to be able to, in the process, before that semi-finalist round interview, to talk with the consultant, to keep talking with them throughout the process about where evolution has occurred. Some searches, for example, might take 4 or 5 months, and where the consortium was in the month 1 or the very beginning of the search could be somewhat different by the time they get down to making some final decisions. And so I don't mean to be wishy-washy, but I'll say keeping the conversation moving and continuing to pose the same questions to the consultants, to the committee throughout the process, I think will help prospective candidates or existing candidates to flush out where that productive tension or less productive tension exists, and where there's change even within a consistent point of tension for a consortium.
Jeff, I'll invite you to respond to that question if you like. But I also want to know, beyond, is there anything besides talking to you or talking to Jim, talking to the search consultant, that a candidate or prospective candidate might do to read between the lines, to figure out what is, to try to understand what might not be in the job description?
Sure. And, part of this goes back to, I think, the question that I like to pose at the sort of the beginning of search when I'm meeting with different constituencies on campus, right? So what is it that you're looking for in your next leader? In some ways, that's different than the qualities, right? But you're thinking about what are the outcomes? And so that should be different between different types of institutions, as opposed to everyone wants a collaborative, thoughtful leader, right? That's going to be, I don't want to say the same everywhere, but they're, it's more common. So that's the first way, and I would hope that some of that comes out in the position profile, and so there are some important differences there that candidates would know, so it's not sort of a cookie cutter profile between different types of between different consortia. The other question, remind me, Kiernan, of what the second part was.
So my part was, how do we read between the lines, or get a sense of what else is, what might not be there, apart from calling you and speaking to you about the position. What kind of sleuthing can a prospective candidate do in getting to understand it, and if there's particularly a consortium, if there's something different about the consortium that where we might find our clues?
It's necessarily different for a consortium, but I do think that you all have great networks, right? People at other institutions, at other consortia. This is part of your due diligence, so talk to people, right? Get out there, and you don't have to disclose that you're a candidate, right? Because that's your prerogative not to do that. But if you're open to sort of just testing, saying how are things going at your institution, that's I think that's probably the best way for you to get independent verification.
Yeah, and that's a plug, by the way, for the annual conference of ACL taking place in Norfolk, Virginia next month, October 10th to 12th. You can still register. So it's a great chance to talk and meet your consortium leaders, your peers in this work. And yes, we have lots of dirt to dish. So,
Kiernan, let me chime in with one additional comment. I don't disagree with what Jeff shared. I think that's a terrific approach. I want to add, though, that there is a risk in trying to read the tea leaves and sort of really scrutinize where there's nothing to be read. And so that's I just want to go back to that point. That I think triangulate, gathering information, gathering different perspectives. Great example, great idea. But not to assume that there's an agenda beyond what is shared or what's the broader understanding. When you talk with colleagues, folks who have an affiliation or familiarity with the organization of that sort. So anyway, it's more often the case than not where folks are saying, oh, but what do they really want? And I repeat back for the third time or the fourth time, and we're not, for folks in my role and Jeff's role, the very best we can do is to be candid, to be thoughtful, and describe with clarity what we understand to be the needs and the aspirations for these organizations, rather than to sort of only a select few will get the true story, if you will.
I appreciate that comment, Jim. Definitely well noted. So we have another excellent question, this time from Charlene from Elvaic. Charlene, you are on the line.
So actually, this is Diane.
Oh, hi, Diane. Sorry.
Sorry. We have a group here. Great. Our question is, this is Diane Dimitrov, sorry, and this is Elvaic's question. Understanding each consortium is distinctive, where are some areas ACL can focus professional development efforts to build the next generation of consortial leadership?
Jim, how about you start us off with it's a good one.
So my thought is really it came to my mind right away. It's to find a vehicle for sharing best practices across the array of ways in which consortiums deliver value to their members. And so you might even task and reward members of ACL who take on those kinds of research projects and share the results of their findings. And that's really to be able to have a couple of signature reports, maybe only 2 per year, but being able to have a means for propagating good insights that have been culled from across ACL's membership.
And Jeff, anything to add to that? What can we at ACL be doing to cultivate these leaders of consortium?
Yeah, and I think part of it is also sharing some of those best practices with the institutions that they're affiliated with the consortia, right? Because part of it is in your control and part of it's not, to be perfectly frank. Sometimes the institutions need to be educated on sort of what the best practice is and how you all as leaders and potential leaders of individual consortiums can help them, and they may not be thinking that way. So I think it's sort of an extension of what you said, Jim, but I think you can take it back to the host institutions and really expand the effort.
So Jeff, follow up on that. And to flip it for a moment. So in the searches that you do for presidents of colleges and universities, is there any discussion of their capacity for or interest in interinstitutional collaboration? Is that a skill, a talent that comes up in your searches for presidents, so that you're looking for leaders who think beyond their campus walls? Obviously, in partners, there's partnership as part of the job, so it's fundraising. But to what extent are they thinking about, is the consortium coming up in those searches, or, if not, why do you think not? And what can we do to make sure that that's happening?
So I'd say more often I hear sort of external partnerships broadly. I don't think people are necessarily talking about the type of institutional collaboration that you all do at ACL. I think it could be part of what they're thinking, but it's usually not sort of broken out explicitly. The reality is some of this is, when you look for a leader, a campus leader, a president, some of the skills that you're talking about here are transferable, right? So if you're able to do some of the other external partnership building, there's no reason why you wouldn't also be able to, as president, do this type of work. To me.
Uh-oh. I'm seeing that Jeff is frozen in time on our screen. Jim, why don't we switch it to you while we work out the technology issues on Jeff's side. Jim?
I think Jeff hit the nail on the head in terms of the broader partnerships that are, in my initial comment, I was describing how partnerships will play an even more important role for consortial leaders and thinking creatively, thinking in new ways. There's not a lot of low-hanging fruit to help consortiums deliver new value, greater value for their members. Maybe that's an overgeneralization or a little bit, I hope not cynical, but there are really sharp folks in these pools, and their ideas, their creative solutions, and what they see as opportunities for the future through partnerships with other beyond the member organizations, the member colleges or universities. That's just a gold mine, and I think that's to pivot back. I think that's what colleges and universities are increasingly looking for, whether it's again with industry, with government, with certain sectors of the economy. Healthcare, for example, you see plenty of institutions building on their existing success and really have growing those pillars of excellence and through discreetly through partnerships they have with organizations beyond their college or university.
Thanks, Jim. We have
Looks like Jeff is back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know how much you could hear, but all of a sudden my screen froze. So hopefully this is better.
We're good.
Okay.
So, Jeff, I think we got most of your response there. So I'm going to move on to a follow-up question. We have from Amy Cronin from the New York Six. Amy, will you follow up with your question, your follow-up to Elvaic's question?
Yes, I wanted to follow up to the question Diane posed. And I think you're right that, sharing best practices and compiling those in some fashion can be very helpful. But just to get maybe a little, further into the weeds or whatever, we try with our ACL events, our conference and that sort of thing to really help people build the skills that will help them advance in their career. So on a more individual basis, what kinds of professional development do you think would benefit mid-level managers based on what you've seen in terms of skill sets and candidates and that sort of thing? What would benefit those managers who aspire to leadership roles in consortia? And I'm particularly interested, you've both mentioned this concept of leading through influence, and I think we all have some sense of what that is, and we try to do it as we can. But what kinds of things, ideas do you have about how we could help ACL members, executive directors, manager level staff who come to our conferences or participate in our webinars? How could we help them develop those leading through influence skills? What are those skills, and how can we help folks develop them?
Jeff, we'll give you the first shot at that one.
Sure. So, I'll talk about leading through influence in a minute, but I think another sort of just core competency is the financial management piece. I think that it depends on the organization, obviously, but oftentimes you do see that as a core component of sort of a senior level job, right? An executive director that isn't always, you don't get as much of that experience necessarily. It depends on the organization structure at mid-level management. So, there are some workshops that I think ACL probably maybe you could provide, but I think also advocating at your own organizations for opportunities to sort of be able to learn some of those skills is important. In terms of the sort of the opportunities to figure out how to lead through influence, I think that's hard. I think a lot of that is, there are things you could probably learn through workshops and seminars, but I think a lot of this has to happen on the ground, and sort of you've got to figure out your own pathway as a leader and how to do that. I think there are ways to sort of seek out those opportunities in your organization, and to, these may be new innovations, new things that you're bringing, and you have to persuade others that this is the right path to take. I don't know that there's sort of one sort of cut and dry way to sort of learn how to do a lot of that.
So I think that this is incumbent upon us consortia leaders to mentor and develop those in our own organizations. But this is, nevertheless, it's a real challenge for those consortia who there are so many of them in ACL, which are just one. That's a consortium staff of one. So, Jim, do you have any thoughts on how somebody in that sort of position can seek out these opportunities to develop, or what ACL should be doing to help them?
Sure. One example that comes to mind is where you have limited bandwidth from the part of the consortia to really look at, well, let me put forward an example of something that I think is an exemplar. Great Lakes Colleges Association runs a 1 week long summer workshop, and it's for folks leaving the faculty, moving to the very beginning of their administrative careers as they make that pivot into administrative leadership. It's an article in the Chronicle maybe 5 years back that has a really nice profile describing what it is that GLCA sought to do and how they pulled together the resources to bring it to fruition. That program now runs many faculty and early career administrative leaders through this program that exposes them to all sorts of example of finance and administrative budgeting experiences that when they do get back to their campus that next fall, they bring with them broader understanding, the ability to ask, if I can say, smarter questions or better questions, more strategic questions, because they've, by virtue of participating in that workshop, they've been able to get the kind of exposure that otherwise would require shadowing 10 different colleagues at their home institution. To the earlier question about when you have a staff of one, finding ways to build those fellowships or shadowing experiences across the member organizations, that can be a great way to ask folks to get the ball rolling, get things started in terms of who would be willing to shadow, where, for example, functionally is a good place to start and develop a good cohort, build from one functional area onward to help expand it and improve the pipeline for leaders on campuses and so forth.
Thanks, Jim. So as we look at the clock and come upon the close of our hour together, I'd like to give each of you a chance to offer any final comments, and in those comments to consider how all of this is changing. If there's a difference in between what consortium boards might have been looking for years ago and what they're looking for today. Jeff, do you want to kick us off with kind of closing comments here?
Sure. So from what I've seen, Jim mentioned this before, the turnover at the presidential level is happening more often. The reality is the turnover in a lot of other senior administrative roles on campuses are happening more often. So certainly that creates challenges and opportunities, as we've already just discussed, for leaders of consortia. I think what I've seen also is that greater recognition that in many cases, even for partnerships that are largely academic, that this job, the executive director job, is not exclusively an academic position, right? And so you don't necessarily need an academic or a former academic leader to lead the organization. Now, different consortia that I've seen are in different places here and sort of their thinking on this, but the broad trend, I think, is moving more towards someone who can come in and run an organization. And it's an academically affiliated organization, certainly, so needs to understand broadly what that means, but doesn't necessarily have to have been a scholar in their own right.
And Jim?
That's terrific. I mean, as Jeff shared, that notion of one needing to be credible, not just with funders, with friendly or familiar audiences, but to be able to be compelling and articulate and command an audience that perhaps of skeptics. Those aren't simply it's not only or exclusively the domain of former faculty who've moved on to administrative leadership roles. I think that's just a terrific insight that those folks, we've found them and continue to look for them across all of higher ed and higher ed affiliated or associated organizations, getting accreditors and so forth. I mean, there's all sorts of great thinkers and folks who have the fire in their belly to not just carry the flag, but to change the future in remarkable ways. To answer your question more directly, if there's one big change over time, I think it's the need. I'll provocate the term I'm going to use is the need to show value right out of the gate so the opportunity to have 12 months, 18 months to learn about the members and be able to take your time and then put forward ideas for enhancement and build buy-in. That kind of timeline just is pretty infrequent. And I think that folks who are thinking about these kinds of careers, these kinds of moves or moving into that president role of the consortia will need to know and would benefit from knowing that there will be pressure and eyes on you to be able to show value of the consortium to all of its members in a pretty short period of time. And so that's certainly don't share that to intimidate or discourage. It's the world we live in now. And again, I see Jeff nodding. I know he feels the same way, that there were just really tremendous professionals from across higher ed and higher ed affiliated organizations that can and will lead these organizations in the great work they do. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and looking forward to talking with you all in the years to come.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks, Jeff. I think I speak for myself. I speak for the participants on this webinar, and I speak for all of ACL to say that we are not intimidated by the prospect of having to demonstrate our value. It's something that we certainly live with usually on a daily basis. So a lot of what ACL is doing is trying to equip leaders and their staff with tools and strategies for demonstrating the value of their enterprises. And as you read from the higher ed headlines these days, it's the collaboration is more important than ever if we're going to survive. So I am just going to quickly share my screen here as a closing moment. I want to say thanks to Jim and Jeff. This is their contact information if you want to reach out to them. Of course, you can also look them up online to reach out to them. I'm sure they would be happy to take your questions offline if you want to email them or email me, and I'll forward them on. This is certainly a business of relationships, and so I appreciate your giving us the opportunity, Jim and Jeff, to extend our hand to you and vice versa. To those participants on the program, on this webinar, please respond to our post-program questionnaire. You'll be getting an email from us very soon, just in the next hour or so, in fact. Please also consider attending our annual conference in Norfolk next month, and our next webinar, November 7th, on sharing legal services. This will be led by the Associated Colleges of the South, who have an innovative model for sharing legal services across their members. On behalf of the ACL Virtual Professional Development Committee, this is Kiernan Mathews from the COACHE Project at Harvard, thanking everyone for your participation, and especially Jim and Jeff for your candor and expertise today. Thanks so much.